This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business psychos, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business psychos. Yeah. The business psychos.
Welcome to Business Psychos, where we discuss how to navigate the complexity of corporate culture and modern life without becoming a psycho. I'm Mary. This is Katie, and we are the Business Psychos. Hey, Katie, what's up?
So, ahead of this week's discussion, this morning, I listened to If Books Could Kill podcast, specifically the episode on the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. The book itself, famously banned in prisons, presents such a sinister, fantastical view of power dynamics. And as a substitution for that ridiculous book, as it relates to the subject matter that we're going to cover in this episode, is I suggest Sun Tzu's The Art of War, the well-known book written in 500 BC. What is less known is that Sun Tzu was a Taoist farmer who observed nature and wrote the book as an application for the military. He observed the natural rhythms and the patterns in the way nature operated, and he wrote what's literally considered to be the most long-standing and widely adopted, business strategy book. One of the quotes is, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," versus the ridiculous, convoluted, so-called Bible for psychopaths of the 48 Laws of Power. And shout out, If Books Could Kill podcast and anything with co-host Michael Hobbs absolutely can't be missed. Books Could Kill is one of my favorite podcasts.
Katie, I don't know if you saw my rhododendron video on Instagram, but I was super proud of it. It's you reach a point in your life where you're like, the flowers are blooming. This is awesome.
Give the listeners a treat and share the rhododendron video on the Business Psychos. The moment of Zen would serve many folks. I know as it did me.
After this episode, people are going to need it.
I think that's a fact.
And I'm not kidding when I said buckle in. This is so we're talking about shame today. One of the most powerful and destructive emotions. This might be low confidence and self-persecution, or even being judgmental. These character traits have significant impacts in the workplace.
And Mary, this episode and this two-part series, the working title is Shame, and we've shifted our production to accommodate 2 episodes.
Absolutely. When we come back, we're talking about shame here on Business Psychos. We're back. I wanted to throw another dimension into this conversation around shame. So far, we've been focusing on reconciling shame between employees of a company. In line with the rise of social media, it's become commonplace for companies to establish social media handles and for unhappy customers to post complaints on them. I've done it myself. Most of the time, complaints are general in nature, but sometimes customers call out specific employees, even posting pictures, names, or providing other identifiable information. I've never done that. This often jumps from constructive criticism to public shaming, humiliation, and even threat. But I think there are possibilities for these types of interactions to occur in more mature and healthy ways. So I am someone who, Katie, you will not be surprised to know, has very high expectations from a service perspective.
I actually, in defense of you, want to mention that you also will post very well articulated, specific accounts of great experiences. So you're balanced. You're balanced. In my Twitter bio, it says this account is just for complaining to companies.
Oh, does it really?
It's effective.
I get it.
You mentioned having high standards, pointing out when things don't meet the mark, but you're also very charitable about pointing out stuff that does. But this is a crossover. What you were talking about, the difference between bullying and constructively holding someone accountable. So we've talked about how shame runs in families and how it both creates the next generation of bullies, but also of people who internalize negative messages and then speak to themselves in toxic ways. We talk a lot about parental dynamics that are related to shame, but also referenced in earlier in part one is the impact of not only shame and family dynamics, but like the social and cultural dynamics that make shame possible in everyday life. And for consideration, trauma pioneer Bessel van der Kolk, who is the author of the astronomically successful New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about trauma being a cultural issue, that it's political and societal. So every workshop I've done with him ends with a section where he talks about and acknowledges how it's not socially sanctioned to acknowledge that all trauma is an outcropping of war and social systems. It's not surprising that people who have unresolved issues with shame contribute to unhealthy work environments. If your organization tolerates this behavior for too long, the behavior becomes normalized into its culture. Cultures that create a lot of competition and individualism foster environments where everyone is fighting for themselves. I do believe that in today's workplace, it's much less tolerant of these kinds of bad behaviors than 20 plus years ago. One reason being that the cultural tolerance for cruel behavior continues to decline. A revolution that was probably kicked off by Meryl Streep's nightmare boss portrayal in Devil Wears Prada. Organizations are doing more to train managers and leaders on empathy, bias, and interpersonal relationships. But not all of this calls out power dynamics, bullying, hierarchy, or shame specifically. The more nuanced kind of shaming we discussed earlier is that it tends to be less obvious, so that people tend to fly under the radar. And it's not like anger management issues where the person has no control over their behavior and the outcomes are just really plain and easy to see. For example, like somebody having a meltdown or engaging in some type of like physical event. The personal example that I'll share, I had a boss who bullied me with personal manipulation, like negging my education, did really intermittent communication with kind of sneak attacks, and ultimately held my advancement over my head. He masochistically appeared to savor these sneak attacks and kind of like enjoy watching quite frankly, like the power he had over me. I was completely immersed in the torture. It was all I ever thought about. I thought about quitting all the time. It was my first thought when I woke up in the morning, and it'd be like my last thought when I went to bed. At one point, the company was going to give me a reward, something about leadership, but he blocked it. And I learned about this through HR flagging their concern for me. But they told me they were powerless against him because he was just such an organizational bully that they were afraid of him. And I was up for a promotion, another example, and he told me the work I presented him wasn't at the level necessary. And then he went and presented that work as his own to another department.
Oh my goodness.
Unbeknownst to him, I'd asked someone in that department to proof that work. So when they saw it, they told me about it thinking this represented a triumph for me. And I remember seeing red. I actually didn't know what seeing red was. And I was like, oh, you actually see red. You're so angry. I guess all the blood rushes to your head or something. And then I read Eckhart Tolle's New Earth. This was, in that era. So this timestamps this a bit. And his concept of the pain body hit me really hard. This notion that it takes two to tango, essentially, in these types of dynamics. And I realized that I was contributing to the dynamic by being afraid of him. And my strategy had been to fawn. I thought I was being really smart by playing to his considerable ego with flattery and fake admiration. Obviously, it didn't work, but I wasn't about to let reality get in the way of, good rationalization. And in a can't unknow this moment, I just stopped reacting to him. I literally unhooked from the dynamic. I started responding matter-of-factly, with just the facts. Didn't take his bait. And just let go. I was free. So 2 weeks later, he called me and said that moving forward, I'd be reporting to someone else. He had nothing to feed on and was going to look somewhere else. I wasn't hostile. I was unbothered. And even stranger, it became a lions into lambs type of situation that, once the true power in our dynamic was revealed, I held the power. He started this weird, highly gendered campaign of fawning and sending pictures of his kids with these cutesy messages that I still cringe to this day, just about how special and wonderful I am, which was there was one he sent of his little toddler son, and whatever the kid's name was, I'll call him Adam. Adam wants you to thinks you're the best. And it was what is happening here? Oh my God. I still cringe to this day, obviously. And I will say, as a counter to that this type of example implies that all of these toxic dynamics are ultimately within our behavior. And I counter that. I do not think that is entirely true. And I also think that, above the director level, the elephant in the room always involves gender. I've also had impossible situations with sexist behavior where the only thing left to do was go directly to the CEO. So, for example, I had a boss for a brief period who wouldn't meet with me. And when he did, he talked about his wife and kids. And I'm thinking, I'm not married and I don't have kids. You can't figure out how to relate to me. So you're talking to me about the only woman in your life. And when I tried to get to approving strategy, budget, comp plans, he would deflect and belittle me. I spoke to many senior women execs at the time, and they all advised me not to rock the boat. But I did rock the boat. And he was no longer my boss. So I was moved back to reporting to the CEO. He kept his job. And in an organization that will not take swift action against that kind of behavior, there were other similar surprises in store for me. For anyone that's in these difficult situations, and having been in them myself, they're paralyzing, they're disempowering, and any implication that what you should be doing is something about yourself is something that I would be remiss not to point out that I don't think that is, that's a fair assessment. Finally, I'll say some organizations with poor leadership, they might believe that shaming behaviors set a high performance bar, treating people badly and making an example of them, set the tone for expectations and improve productivity and work quality. The opposite is true. I have spent a good part of my career working in high-growth tech startup space where innovation, collaboration, and teaming are critical to success. In my experience, these characteristics are difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. in cultures where psychological safety and mutual respect are not maintained. Technology has been an early leader in recognizing the criticality of interpersonal trust to speed and innovation. Like Agile is founded on principles about team models where people collaborate in an environment of mutual respect and psychological safety. Agile team models are built around human beings' ability to form cohesive, safe groups. Professional work dynamics, which propose models of humiliation and shame, aren't just unethical and outdated. They just don't work. In case people need another reason not to allow tricky behavior at work. The research shows that it leads to revenue generation and growth.
Woo! This is heavy stuff. Go and grab a coffee. Hang tight. We'll be right back. I remember we did that show on performance and culture, and the two toxic workplaces we mentioned in that show, using the fictitious shows Succession and Wall Street, great examples of where it was normalized to belittle and humiliate people publicly. And this becomes contagious. Shame can mutate from boss to employee to then exist between all employees. It's like a real life Lord of the Flies, or like you said, Game of Thrones, survival of the fittest model. And it becomes cultural to act aggressively to avoid being seen as weak. And I'm glad you brought up Agile, as you said, founded on research around trust and team size. The research around the biological markers of shame absolutely confirms that it destroys everything you are trying to build in your workforce. Shame has neurological effects on the brain. It can trigger an automatic stress response that can shut down the brain's prefrontal cortex. The part of the brain, by the way, which controls logical thinking, which seems kind of important for work. It also can cause the amygdala to stay in alert mode, which can cause a person to stay in freeze, flight, or fight mode. This is why shame-infused corporates can be so toxic. Aside from the negative impact to individuals' mental health, shame damages individualism, enforces groupthink, and shuts down learning.
Sorry, Mary.
Not great for innovation or risk mitigation. When we come back, we're going to wrap up our discussion on shame.
He's off the rails right now. He's really going wild.
He doesn't like these long episodes.
Yeah, I think he's kind of like...
He's pointing out his little fur watch.
It's so cute. His little... Oh my god! I'm sorry. Oh my god!
I think you need to keep that in there. You need to keep him crying and me. He's like, can we wrap this up? Let's go.
Oh my god. You're playing a little fur watch, aren't you? Okay. So we're back talking about shame at work. A few recommendations for folks who are experiencing toxic shame, specifically in the workplace, as we wrap up today. Some of the antidotes for shame were mentioned in part 1 and can be found with greater elaboration in the Parinoma method. Reduce or eliminate shame about wanting what you want. Do that type of exploration where you're exploring what it is that you want, what matters to you. Like, establish your long and short-term values. Explore this, or it'll be prescribed to you. Know your worth. Do an inventory of the things that matter to you that don't change based on your career, like love, your interests, goals, people, animals, family, nature, the magnificent, simple things. Then separately invest the time to make an inventory of your career from the perspective of value creation on your terms. What have you done that you are most proud of? And spend time doing this. when in a conflict and negotiation, get rabidly curious about what matters to the other party and focus on that. Focus on aligning how when you get what you want, they get what they want, and making a case for that. Learn tools that work for you for emotional regulation. Use time to your advantage. Ask for it. Ask for the time to think things over and use that time to regulate and create a clear-headed response. If you're somebody who grew up in an environment with critical, shaming caregivers, and now you carry toxic shame, commit to yourself to work on it. Like therapy with a qualified professional might work. There are so many great books that can be a good place to start. In addition to that, or if therapy isn't accessible to you right now, begin working on this on your own. I developed the Parinama method for individuals who are ready to start to unpack, process, and grow beyond challenges like carrying around toxic shame. So check out the comments in this podcast for links to my book. You can find it theparinamamethod.com if you want to learn a little bit more about it. There's also a YouTube channel. You mentioned something earlier, Mary, about taking stock of your work stressors and evaluating whether they are related to shame. For example, maybe you're at a point in your career where you need to present in large groups and do public speaking. If you suffer from toxic shame, you may find your career growth obstructed by unresolved issues of self-consciousness. It might be helpful to talk to your manager about your career ambitions and seek support, like training on public speaking, to help support you. Now, I think that even organizations that create community around this kind of stuff, like Toastmasters, please remember that the creation of an inner critic is a protection, and that in its creation, you suffered unfairly. The adaptation as a child to combat feelings of fear and insecurity by identifying with the people who shame and cushioning the blow with preemptive judgments. Start with awareness. Talk back to that voice. When there's a voice in your head that says something bad about yourself, call it out. Talk back to it. That said, you also should consider how shame might be showing up in your work. So this is essential for you, especially if you're a people manager. You do not want to get yourself in a position where you suffer career setbacks, disciplinary action, or worse, cause harm to people who fall within your duty of care because of blind spots in your self-awareness.
Fantastic guidance, Katie. Organizations have a part to play here too, and it goes beyond just putting words like empathetic and respectful culture in your company handbook. Culture starts at the top. Boards need to insist that their executive and senior leadership teams are hired for their emotional intelligence as much as for their IQ. The top of the professional pyramid is a smaller world than you might imagine. Everyone is 1 degree of separation from one another, so it's not hard to know about someone's character and behavior from their prior organization. I've seen examples where an executive is hired by a new company after quite public failures at another. Don't be that company. I worked for an amazing person who used to tell us all that he wouldn't tolerate smart jerks in his world, and he didn't. He set the tone, but more importantly, followed through with it. He's now a successful CEO with a loyal following of people who would do anything for him, me included. My next recommendation is to integrate 360 feedback into your performance processes for all roles. This should be a mix of aggregated, quantified feedback from peers, direct reports, their reports, and other key people in other departments. The feedback should also include options for qualitative feedback with a preference for this to be captured via verbal interviews. I'm a big fan of more frequent but simplified performance processes versus the old-timey twice-a-year model. This is important when gauging leadership performance on interpersonal strengths because feedback can be impacted by unpopular business decisions leaders might be required to make. Frequent, specific feedback evaluated over time will enable the parsing out of worrying trends from any noise in the machine outside of the leader's control. The score for this feedback should be integrated into promotion and compensation decisions and weighted such that it's taken seriously by everyone. Finally, companies need to invest both time and money in developing, reinforcing, and promoting positive behaviors. Training on interpersonal dynamics should be customized for employees at each layer of the organization and occur on a regular cadence, at least yearly. I've designed and facilitated these throughout my career, and today provide both services to companies as well as coaching to individuals as part of my advisory work. If you have questions or are interested in supporting your business or yourself, contact me through the link in the comments below. Well, Katie, this was, as expected, a great topic. I spend most of my time these days at the intersection of workplace and human capital strategy, and everyone talks about and wants to solve the culture problem, but what most folks don't know, like where to even begin. I would add that the work starts with the individual, and the programs need to be scalable and reinforced through both rewards and disciplinary procedures.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to come back. We're going to throw something else into the mix next on Business Psychos. Hang tight, psychos. We'll be right back. I'm working with an executive today through my advisory practice who recently shared an almost inconceivable story with me. Obviously, I'm going to protect their name. I really wanted to include it in this episode. Let's call this woman Alice. She's a partner at one of the big four consulting firms who was passed over for a management role that she felt she was qualified for. Her new boss, let's call her Bertha, took her aside and told her that she should start looking for another role in the firm. Katie, these stories, depressing, infuriating, and far too common. All the organizations today talk about empathetic leadership and mutual respect for colleagues. They usually have policies and procedures against hostile behavior. But short of egregious bullying and or physical intimidation, a lot of these unhealthy behaviors still happen without HR intervention.
It's like the Robert Greene's 48 laws of power, one being never outshine the master. And also all this Game of Thrones stuff.
Yes, Game of Thrones.
Every single move you make in this position, if you're Alice, is really complicated, because what you're doing is, if what you're trying to do is subdue the situation, everything you do to protect yourself is likely going to exacerbate it. So in a state where you're probably already drained, you're now being called to battle, so to speak. So
it's checkmate, right? It's a checkmate play, and it's time to. And we did that our episode of outgrowing people and places, right? This is time to go.
Well, and it's time to go. And a lot of times when we're talking about scenarios here and they're removed from the specific, you've been providing these really specific vignettes that I feel when I'm dropped in them, it creates a very different feeling about that notion of it's time to go. Because as an academic exercise to say, look, it's time to go, you better have your plan ready, versus, as I would imagine, Alice is immersed in the job. She's invested in doing being effective and successful. There are reasons like relationships, work that she finds fulfilling, even just day-to-day stuff. That just the idea that the disruption, it's like the storm's coming in. And I want to bring this up as a point of empathy for anybody's listening, to just kind of be there with you if you're in this state, not feeling like change is coming for you, whether you're ready or not. It's so tough. And we can, we'll have all the discussions about the fact that change, it can shift you to sort of higher levels and all that. But I think for this moment, just leaving some space for the, the feelings of it and producing some empathy around it.
This is what can create so much emotional angst for employees when they're trying to understand and play by the rules. And then things work out and they don't align to those rules at all. This is a little bit of what our podcast does, right, Katie? We kind of talk about these areas. We don't need to read you your employee handbook. You guys know what your rules are. And some of these things are, sometimes it's illogical and sometimes it's not fair.
I think the point that's unfair is that the rule book that you're handed walking in the door is not the rule book that the game is played by.
Yep.
And that is the part that is unfair. And there are people that are just born knowing how to play politics, and they drop in and they can calibrate themselves to figure out exactly how to play the organizational game. And then there are people that are very literal. They take that playbook, they memorize it, and they're like, I am going to do the best job by this playbook. So, I think absolutely this is what we're talking about in this podcast. And it is, I think, both of our hope that this discussion, if this changes somebody's approach to their job, 5%, it will change their life. Like 5%.
And you're not crazy. And you're not crazy because that experience you just described, Katie, sometimes can take years or a career to figure out. And while you're figuring it out, you might take a couple runs at it and be like, all right, well, this boss, well, this organization will be different. I'll play by the rules. And it's just, it's demoralizing, and it takes its toll on your self-esteem and your confidence. And so I think what we're trying to say is it's not you. There's this other thing that exists, and you just need to know how to navigate it.
I think that's a really important point about the hope that power grappling and these types of interpersonal dynamics just don't exist in other places. But the thing is that if without an understanding of these dynamics that are really happening subconsciously for like really everyone involved, without awareness of surfacing them, the dynamics just follow people around, and they wind up making to the point of being unfair, and also creating really mistaken senses of internalized negative self-image. Like the idea is, oh, there's something like wrong with me, versus there's a dynamic that I'm playing out that has a predictable outcome. And it's not that bad things follow me. It's that this is a dynamic that's beneath the conscious layer that once surfaced, and once I can reconcile, I can shift the outcomes for it. And that will transform and change everything that happens, or change a lot of things. But anyway, great discussion, Mary. If you have comments or stories about how shame has affected you at work, drop us a note in the comments. I can't wait to hear what our listeners think. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so hit us up on our socials. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook under @BusinessPsychosPod. Bye.